Assimilation policies in Canada were built off the idea that white European Christian culture was superior to the pre-existing Indigenous culture in Canada. They would first try to replace Indigenous culture in Indigenous people through enfranchisement, land grants, other different work programs. When this didn't work, they believed that it was in the best interest of Indigenous people to quote-unquote kill the Indian in them to save the man. And through this, they would rip their children from them and send them to residential schools with the belief that they needed to completely sever the cultural, linguistic values and all the things that come with it from the child and replace it with Canadian culture. Now, when they first send you a residential school, as Bev Sellers outlines in her book, they would give the boys haircuts, the girls haircuts too. They'd be deloused. A very dehumanizing process. This would set the standard for the ways that Indigenous people were dehumanized at residential schools, something Bev Sellers outlines in her book many, many times. Now, once this delousing process was done, you were sent to your room, and then this is where the many years of psychological, sexual, and physical abuse at the hands of priests and nuns would then begin. As Bev Sellers outlined in her book, even as a young child, if you wet the bed, you were beat, you talked back. Many things that children do was beat. You were beat for it. It was the whole spare the rod, spoil the child idea. This is something that Bev Sellers outlines in her book many, many times. Many of the boys were beat, and then once you got a bit older, for the girls at least, many of the boys too, I can say this. Sexual abuse is something that would also run rampant at these schools, something that Bev Sellers talks about a lot in the narrative of her book. She mentions 2 times, one time being Father O'Connor, who would sexually abuse and rape the girls in the school band. Did this many times, most notably at the Expo 67. He took them to Montreal, where he would sexually abuse them. Then the other example of sexual abuse she mentions is her brother Mike, who she believes was sexually abused as a child, and that is the reason for him turning to alcohol and drugs, and then later killing himself. This is not a one-off thing. Many, many children at residential schools were physically, sexually, and psychologically abused as children, leading to many adverse effects as an adult. Bev Sellers even outlines it in her book. She says it beautifully. She says that all of the social ills that run rampant on reserves and amongst the Indigenous population in Canada can be traced back to assimilation policies and, most importantly, their time spent at residential schools.
So what are some of these social ills that Indigenous people face? Well, one is substance abuse or alcohol abuse to ease the pain caused by residential schools. It's the basic fact. The trauma caused at residential schools is the leading cause for Indigenous people, turning to drugs and alcohol. It's something that Bev Sellers talks about a lot in her book. She talks about many members of her community on the reserve turning to alcohol to ease the pain. Most importantly, she talks about her brother Mike, who would become homeless and an alcoholic. And the one time he got sober, he said it was the worst day of his life because all he could remember was his time spent at the mission, that he had to keep drinking. It wasn't he wanted to get drunk, he liked getting drunk, he had to get drunk because it was the only thing that stopped the memories of residential schools. And that's what it is for lots of Indigenous people, is that they weren't taught how to deal with the trauma. They were cut off from traditional ways of healing, and then they were physically, sexually, mentally abused, and then just kicked back out in society with nowhere to go and no way to heal themselves. Other social ills involve domestic violence. Many of them were abused as children and therefore went on to repeat the cycle of abuse. Bev Sellers outlines this many times in her book. She talks about her husband who would physically abuse her. She says many times she was very rough with her children because she didn't know how to love herself and love her kids. Something that the Familiar Police did is they cut off the teachings of your grandparents and your parents being passed down to you. So you didn't know how to raise your children. You only taught the way that the mission raised children, which was through, you can call it tough love, whatever you want to call it. It was through abuse. She finds herself doing this many times, screaming at her kids when she shouldn't. And her husband, obviously, she blames his actions toward his children on his time spent at the mission. For Indigenous people, the connection between assimilation policies and the social ills that they now face in reserves is very obvious. As outlined in Mark McGuire's research on the Haida Nation, he interviews many Haida elders, and they blame all of their social problems on the oppressive system of the Canadian government and assimilation policies. And it's obvious, it's a true fact that assimilation killed Indigenous culture. It was a cultural genocide, and it had horrible effects that we still see to this day: generational trauma, alcohol abuse, to name a few. Assimilation policies were horrible and have had a long lasting adverse effect on Indigenous communities.